Hello. Perfect. Hey Nick, how you doing?
Hey, David, doing well. How you doing?
Brilliant. Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today on our very first webinar as part of Qala. And then what I really want to do is actually give you the opportunity to give yourself an intro, and I'll give you a second now. I think to set the expectations of all the people that have joined, to understand what the session's about. What today's session is really about is talking about a buy versus build when it comes to software development, and especially when it comes to building out products. In terms of the scope, I think it's quite a big, broad scope to talk about, and we'll go into more details around that. And then the idea is we'll go through the pros and cons between buy versus build and the different thinking processes that need to happen along the way. And then at the end, we'll have a bit of a question and answer session from some of the members that have joined us. Does that sound great?
Sounds good to me. Hopefully the
Perfect.
audience is ready.
Yeah. So, Nick, why don't you give us a quick intro to yourself?
Yeah. Hello to everyone, and hey, David, thank you again for having me. Very exciting, the first webinar. A little bit about myself. I currently hold a product manager role, kind of overseeing, kind of pointed enough, a platform organization, platform group, from a product perspective, right? So taking very cross-cutting platform things and treating it like a product, even internally. A little bit about myself. I've sort of held multiple hats in the anything as a service, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS sort of thing. Been an engineer myself, and then kind of shifted into the product perspective. So have a unique perspective from an engineering and a product side, and yeah, I have a huge passion for all things platform and what they can do to sort of enable the business itself. So
Perfect. Great. So the theme of today is talking about buy versus build, and I think more specifically, the reason why we started Qala was for three different reasons where we saw there were inefficiencies within product and engineering. The first one was integrations. So how do you actually integrate systems together and to external systems? The other one was data and security and then compliance topics, where there's generally a lot of amount of time spent from engineering product teams. But thirdly, and the one that we actually want to talk about today is these talking about these non-intellectual property services that are very generic in nature, that companies tend to copy and paste across themselves, that don't have sort of that sort of intellectual IP by themselves, but they are fundamentally needed to be able to build a business, especially to power features. And I think the reason why it's very interesting in terms of the buy versus build is because they tend to be black boxes in terms of a business that looks down into them, don't understand the value and why maybe they cost so much to build. Uh, and sometimes it's also very hard to articulate how they can be multipliers to actually build the real product features at scale. So that's going to be the scope of what we do today. It's really focusing on those non really core services that are very generic in nature, that don't have much IP. And the idea is like, yeah, why would you buy or why would you build internally if there is no IP internally? So I think first things first, we spoke about this before, is that before you do anything, you really have to understand why you're building something. So I'm going to give you a bit of space now to say, in terms of your approach, into saying, okay, if you're going to ask engineering teams or product teams to build something, how do you articulate the why message for them?
yeah, and David, this is such a super important one, right? So I know this is exactly why we decided to sort of start with this topic, but um, it's at the end of the day, you come to some technical need, right? You need to implement some sort of service, one of these platform components. You need to do those things, right? But the reality of it is that you can't lose sight of how the connection to the business, right? To the customers, to those things, because otherwise, I love the term you use, like it's a bit of a black box, right? Otherwise, it just becomes this, oh, this is technical thing that we need to do. So the important thing is to make sure that you don't lose sight of what brought you to that to begin with, right? So let's use an example of your business or the market is asking for some capability. Typically, it's around the concept of integrating with other systems or potentially integrating with their enterprise things like identity access management, something along those lines. But essentially, your customers are demanding more, right? Or you foresee the market is telling you that they're going to demand more. It's important to keep sight on that why, because when you sit there and ask for funding, ask for time with the resources you currently have, or something along those lines, you don't want to approach that with the thing of, oh, we have to implement this platform service, because you want to make sure that the business understands that how it translates to enabling the business, enabling your customers, bringing in revenue, something along those lines. Because the reality is that a lot of these underlying platform services in their core aren't going to bring you revenue, but they're going to enable something that does. And you said earlier the word multiplier, right? In the industry, that like there's this term called force multiplier, and we love to use that when it comes to platform teams, because the idea is that I'm doing it once, I'm making the investment once to do that, and now let's say I'm a software suite that provides multiple things. I'm now enabling, let's say, 5 different products, 10 different products in my suite to provide that capability. And I only did it once, right? So that force multiplier is a big important thing, and to constantly focus on the why. This isn't just some technical service you're implementing. It's because this. And it's super important to always keep that in mind, always reference that for everything else we're about to talk about.
Yeah, perfect, and completely agree. I think, at that point, when you actually understand the why, there is this sort of understanding at a top level before you engage with products and engineering teams or architecture teams or platform teams, is that you have to understand the overall arching sort of variables that are important to know before you even approach, right? So things like, I don't know, technical complexity or legal security. I mean, maybe take us through some of those in terms of, how do you compartmentalize those variables before you even maybe approach with the why to the teams?
Yeah, 100%. So now that you have this focus, this like ever present focus on like the why, what you're trying to do, you focus on those overarching variables, right? What's the boundaries that you're playing in? Things like technical complexity, right? Like is this just a very cog like easy thing to implement it, or is this a very advanced type of thing that's going in place? The legal and security ramifications of this, right? Um, is this going to be some sort of transactional system that's going to potentially have my customer or other user information going through? Is it opening up additional doors to my system that will bring in for security things? It's always important to understand some of those security things, because those are the boundaries that you're working in. So the why, and then again, like your thing. And the most important one, as always, and this is kind of what drives a lot of these discussions, is the time pressure behind this, right? I mentioned before about are the users asking for something? Is the market asking for something? How long have they been asking for it? Where do you stand there? Are you super behind? Are you ahead of the curve? Is there something that could really give you an advantage? That is going to be a very important thing when it comes to time pressure. And I actually think you had some interesting things. We were chatting this earlier. You had some interesting concepts about time pressure, right? That you wanted
Yes.
to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, I do talks around this quite often, is that there's generally three types of pains that you can feel within an organization, or I don't know, even for maybe your personal life, is that there's existential pains, which means that if you don't do something about it, something's going to happen and you're going to die, right? So ultimately, if this thing isn't resolved
Hopefully, no
so
one's dying
quickly,
in software, but it
yeah.
is possible.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a morbid term, but the idea is that if you don't sort this out very quickly, the idea is that, something's going to bad's very going to happen. And I think in terms of like startups, when they look at even selling or trying to solve a problem, is that if they get to that, then sales cycles are very short. That's how I would articulate it if I was going to try and sell. The second one is more scaling pains. So the idea is that maybe you've solved it very quickly, but this thing only was a bit of a plaster on that cut. And actually now you've got scaling pains and you need to resolve that, because if you don't, then it's going to crash later on and then you're going to feel the pain later on. Typically, I think companies invest in that later on when they actually start feeling the pain again. But the idea is it's not going to bring down the company ultimately. And yeah, the idea is that they were sorted as part of a strategy piece. And then the last one is a nice to have. These are nice to have
Yeah.
pains that, even though they might have a very strong why, in terms of all the other pains that might be felt, it's not as a priority. And I think that usually determines the time pressure in what you might be facing. All right,
Yep. 100%. Yeah, that was a good breakdown of that.
perfect. So I think, now that we're speaking about the why, and we know like why is something so important, before you even take it forward to the business to consider buy versus build, and having that as the overarching theme. And the idea is once you have that, and you've got these overarching variables that you need to keep into consideration. If we were to dive a bit deeper, and you were going to try and take it to the next step, what would be your strategy in taking it to the team to try and understand the decision processing? And I think it's purely because, first things first, is that nothing is ever free on both sides of the spectrum. There's always going to be some upfront cost and sort of maintenance understanding. And ultimately, the reason why you care about that as being the biggest topic in terms of how much is this going to cost us is that you have to have some sort of return on investment. So how would you take that, knowing that? How would you take that forward to the teams, and what is your approach?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the biggest topic that's going to drive along these things is understanding costs, and in many cases, we're not just talking about dollars here, right? It's a lot of moving parts, and ultimately, like you said, ROI is important, which is one of the reasons. Again, kind of, I'm always going to refer back to this, but it's why we start with the why, because when I'm understanding, as we're trying to understand the cost of either direction I go into, right? I can't relate it to the ROI of cool, I implemented it, right? That's not the goal. The goal isn't that, hey, we got the service up and running, it's doing a thing. We always want to tie it back to what is it enabling on top of the end? What is it now bringing out? And that's how we're going to get that ROI, because ROI is a kind of finicky thing. It's kind of hard, especially in these platform things. So the biggest piece of advice that we can hope the viewers kind of walk away with is always tie it back to that why, because that's gonna help the business understand the ROI a little bit better. More. So that's the way that I would kind of approach that conversation.
Yeah,
Is understanding there the big variables. Again, when we mention about security risk, as we're starting to loop in other folks, it's important for them to understand the bounds that we're working on with. And you said it absolutely right. Regardless of whether you buy or build something, nothing is free. There's always going to be some investment that you go into. And again, not just the cost there, but there's joint cost that whatever decision you go on, you're gonna hit regardless. Things like in the integration cost, the cost to integrate, whether you buy something off the off the shelf or you build it yourself, it isn't going to magically solve the needs of the rest of the components in the ecosystem. You need to make sure that you're going to put that investment in actual integration and things like that. So that's, we almost don't want to spend too much time on that cost because it's there either way, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I think that then also talks about the secondary cost, which, generally I feel gets forgotten about, which is the maintenance side. And if you go for a built-in house solution, even though there is upfront cost, which is typically higher than buying a solution off the shelf, it also comes with a maintenance burden as well. And the idea is that if you build it internally, that maintenance percentage is based on the quality of what you built in the first place. So if you build it very well, it's lower maintenance. But if you built it badly, it's going to be 40% to 60% maintenance. And that's per annum in terms of the initial costs. But I think in terms of not just that being the risk factor in terms of return on investment, I mean, talk to me about some of the other risks that you might see in terms of trying to bring something in-house first before you actually try and, buy it off the shelf.
Yeah, I would say the biggest one, just in the interest of time. I mean, there's a few different risks, but the biggest one is that you're in the weeds. Your team is working at it. You decided to build something in house, and they're going on. They're coding. They're making it work. And what happens when people are sitting there is like, man, this is taking too long. We're not realizing, again, they lost sight of the why, they lost sight of the ROI, and they no longer see the things of it. They're not understanding, how it's going to take, the time to amortize that investment that you put up front, right? And funding gets pulled, right? So now, because you decide to put this upfront timing investment into doing something to build it in house, as opposed to like hitting the ground running with something else, you're running the risk of someone not like being impatient, waiting for the thing to actually get built from scratch, right? Um, and it taking too long, and now you end up with this piece of software that's half done, half baked, it's not fully realized there, and that's where it ends up just kind of being this thing that gets shelved. And that's the biggest risk when it comes to these things is if you don't keep your eye on the why, you don't keep your eye on the ROI, you're running that risk whenever you build things in house. And honestly, even if you do have the ROI in mind, if it's taking too long to build something,
Yeah,
you could still run that risk of it just it never sees fruition.
absolutely. I think, then the caveat to that is that that's one risk, but the idea is if you do buy something off the shelf, there's other risks, right? In terms of maybe they have
Yep,
a data
definitely.
breach, security compromises, maybe they go bankrupt. Again, like what would be the considerations for you if you were going to look for the caveats to the risks of internally running out of money because there's no more sponsorship? What would it look like if you were going to go for an external vendor?
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely right. One of the things if you're going to be looking for there, and this concept of nothing is free, and you're kind of comparing the prices of things. It's important to understand the reputation of those vendors as well, right? Because like you just said, the compliance or security cost that goes into it. Sometimes you're going to pay a premium for people who have a proven track record or a proven knowledge in that information. Because again, when we talk about the continued cost of things, that could be one of the factors of it. So you don't want to just choose anything off the shelf because they say they do it. You want to make sure that you understand what the vendor's coming from. You want to understand that they are indeed experts in this and they can kind of know how to go through those things.
Yeah,
The other part of buying off the shelf is, you're it depends on how much control you want to have, right? Because of course, if you buy something off the shelf, there's going to be a lot of configurations, and especially if they've been in this game for a while, there's going to be a lot of flexibility. But ultimately, you're at the mercy of the features and capabilities that they are providing, right? So if you have your own internal security team, or your business is really sticklers about having full control down to the code byte level of everything, that is one of the risks of buying something off the shelf, is you're not going to have that down to the code control of things, which is just a commonplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a conversation earlier, you said something that was really interesting is that if you also decide that you're going to build it internally with the existing resources that you have, the notion is like, what are they not building that actually adds USP or something intellectual to the company, that special magic. So again, maybe you can articulate that a bit more.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that this kind of will lead us into another thing we want to talk about. But let's talk about the different makeup of the teams, right? That you could have, right? Depending on thing. And hopefully folks online or folks listening can this resonate with them. You're either going to be a software company that you have your IP, you have the things you're buying your customers, and those are the only dev teams you have. So when you want to build something that is to service all of those products, you're taking resources from those teams. So that's a direct correlation. What are those members that you just pulled off those teams? What are they not building that's going to provide revenue over there? But let's jump the gun. Let's assume that you have grown as a business, you've distributed your applications enough that you've already committed to the investment of a platform team, right? A team that's focused on these force multipliers that we spoke about before. Um, Even from that perspective, you have to consider what they're not building too, right? So again, you're building from the active teams, but again, if they're spending time, let's say, building something from scratch, they're not realizing the value of what that component can bring, and you slow yourself down on the adoption of multiple services, right? Because that's the whole thing of a platform. We're not just talking about one or two of these loose generic services, these like cogs in the wheel, if you will. There's usually a whole bunch. I mean, just rattling off the top of my head: identity access management, all sorts of communications, whether eventing, webhooks, those are things super important in communication in a distributed system, right? Probably one of the most important. Notifications, data, right, which kind of ties into communication as well, of how data flows around, but big data things. There's a whole laundry list of these different services you need to build, and the more you focus on one, you're pushing out the timeline that these other ones you're gonna be able to realize some value of it, right? So it's important you kind of move through these as quickly as possible, and then go wide, and then sort of start building more complete capabilities of it. And
Yeah.
as we start getting into the buy versus build, some of those capabilities of going deeper, some of that already comes baked in off the shelf, right?
Yeah.
Because so that's the thing we have to talk about, is we do need to consider the expertise that you have on the team, the expertise of around that service, and then the ongoing maintenance just beyond costs, right? And it's not just the tech and remote thing, but it's actually the expertise in the field, right? Um, so that's another one to kind of consider too when we're talking about going deep, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just about tech, and I think you had some examples of this as well, but one thing we have to realize is that there are companies, like Qala, that are experts in this specific field, right? They're this is what they do every day. They're not looking around other things. This isn't like a sub practice for them. So there's some examples of, because of that, there's companies that get on. I think you told me a little bit about an Okta one earlier,
Yeah.
right? Do
Yeah,
you want to explain
exactly.
that one?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea of expertise is that you might have a snapshot of what is needed in the market right now. I think, when Okta came out, all these companies were trying to build their own authentication services. The login forms are login forms. There was a standard sort of around it, or maybe a loose held standard that engineers were talking about. And then Okta came along and said, well, everything's going to the internet, so I'm going to build the login form and authorization service for companies to use so they can forget about it. And really, what companies adopt that did, they're like, oh, actually, that's excellent because now I can actually free my resources to actually focus on the product. I mean, there's a bit of work in terms of authentication, fine. But as the internet started to evolve and there was way more risk in terms of security compliances that you need to achieve, is that at some point that initial snapshot of domain knowledge that you might has to evolve with the times as well. And so it's not just that they're experts then, they actually become experts in that field in deeper levels that you could probably ever do yourself in terms of time and expertise. And I think that's where, to your point, is that if you consider the expertise that you might have in your company, just because you can build it, maybe you shouldn't. So the idea is like, because if you do, you have to keep up with the times and the trends. And is it worth
Yeah.
doing that?
Exactly. It's not just upkeep on the technology. Like, okay, cool. Can I keep this server up and running? Can I keep that Kubernetes cluster active? Whatever, like
Yeah.
health and performance of the tech. Sure. But what does it take for you to keep up with and get ahead of some of the capabilities that are coming out? And it's not just like feature capabilities. Sometimes it could be, again, going back to some of the things of security or even legal things to consider, right? Okta's a perfect example, right? Where as the times are changing and there's different attacks that could happen, right? Different types of things. Here's companies, right, in the IAM space and the data movement space and the integration space. These are companies that are in the market. They're in the know. They're looking at what is the cutting edge thing that's coming, and they're already building features towards that. Whereas if you're building it yourself, that your line of sight isn't there. Um, to use my experience a little bit more closely, there is, I've had the advantage of working with a whole bunch of different, in companies with different fields, with HR and insurance, and all these different like fields that have a lot of compliance. There's a lot of legality that you have to kind of keep up with the time zone. So
Yeah.
you're going to put yourself in a position where you've got all these micro compliance teams that are purposely just trying to keep up with all the regulations and everything they're going through. And that's a big burden to kind of keep, from an
Yeah.
expense and a skill set and all that kind of concept, right? So there's a lot of things where you have to keep in mind this whole thing of like there's companies out there that are providing a service and that is their primary focus. So
Yeah.
consider that their primary focus versus it's a sub focus for you.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that you actually mentioned is that you really focus on the platform engineering side of it, right? So, and the idea is that I guess that a platform engineering is that sort of base layer that then empowers featured sort of teams to be able to work faster. Now, let's say that there is an initial service, and to your point is that a platform team might already be super busy in, trying to build a service that is generic that all these teams can use. Like, what is your take on saying, okay, well, if there is an initial concept, who should own it? Like, who actually owns that initial drive to be able to build the service under the hood? Like, how would you approach that?
Yeah, and again, this is where it differs based on like the makeup of the thing. But again, typically it's driven by some why, right? So go back to like the what and the why. It's driven by that, and that's going to and it might have started in one of your applications or like one of your product offerings. It might have come up in multiple things. It might have come up when you're talking about someone taking on your whole suite, and it's like, hey, does your whole suite have this capability? So that will help drive it. But again, let's jump and assume that you've already committed to there being a platform team, right? And really, it becomes part of how different prioritization skills or different prioritization topics, and then different KPIs as these things are kind of running, right? So from a prioritization perspective, you want to look at things of like the impact it's going to have. How many products is in my suite is this going to enable? How many, like going back to the why, is this going to enable to solve multiple whys? Is it just one? Is it one customer? Is it a whole bunch? Am I trying to get ahead of the market? So that's what's going to help you to prioritize that team, assuming you're already committed to having this team that works on central things, right?
Yeah.
That's what helps prioritization there. Then let's talk about the overrunning like KPIs and how it differs from product teams, right? Because or at least the product teams that are providing things to customers, the folks that are partnering with customers, they're going to look at things like revenue. They're going to look at things like the usage of the features. They're going to look at, sort of the time it took to do, certain things. It's really more about that end user interaction. A platform team's mindset is a little bit different. And this is also the vendors that provide this. These are the ways that they think as well. It's going to be focused on things like the resiliency of the service, right? Especially if these are core components that are enabling all these other things in your ecosystem. Let's say you're a huge company, you've got like 20 different components out there plus, right? You want to be able to check the boxes of these things once, right? You want to be able to say, hey, product A in my ecosystem, by adopting this platform service, you've checked the box on all of these things just by doing that, right? You've checked resiliency. We've got disaster recovery, plans in place, and something, it's automated. You've got highly available infrastructure. You've got all those things, and just check the box. You're good from that perspective. The security aspect of it, data's going through. You've centralized where you want to be SOC compliant or any of those compliance things. You can kind of put those things there. And then you have a team that's focused on cost. And again, this is what the vendors are focusing on it too, making it as efficient as possible. Going back to the force multiplier of this team and of these services is I'm not just saving money because this one team implemented it this way and this one team implemented this way. All the efficiencies that I'm baking into that service now multiply by however many of those products are doing this. And then again, ties the cost, ties the ROI to help compare those things. And then just performance, right? That's another big aspect of it, is you want to be able to handle a lot of that throughput. So again, the platform team's way that things get prioritized and how things get measured from the KPIs differ
Yeah.
a little bit, and that those are important things to keep in mind.
Cool. And I think, we talk about vendors a lot, and I think one of the biggest topics is vendor lock-in. Yeah,
Oh yeah, we can't talk
there's a
about
massive,
virus bill without vendor lock-in. Yeah,
yeah, so I mean there's a massive fear that if you do choose an external vendor, that you're going to be locked in, and it happens, right? Because ultimately there's very big sort of migrational costs that will occur. So again, like what is your thoughts around it? Like if you were going to choose a vendor, what would the approach be?
yeah,
And how would you try and, because I see vendor lock-in not just in terms of external, but you yourself, if you're building it yourself, could also be a vendor that
right.
you've locked yourself in. So like how do you avoid that? Like what is the approach to try and at least mitigate that risk a little bit? Not that you can do all of it, but at some point, like how do you deal with that?
Yeah. First of all, I do want to, because you and I shared a pretty good laugh about this. Is when people look at vendor lock-in, they kind of be like, oh well, I'm locked into a vendor. But the funny fact is, like you said, you can lock in yourself, and we kind of both agreed on that term. And it's funny because you're there and you're like, well, now I built something and it's specific to my business, but now the industry's changing. Now I need to like move on, but I can't because I'm tethered to this thing that I built. Right? You almost lock yourself in. So that's it. So
Yeah.
it's funny that people always think of the external factors for vendor lock-in. But there are ways to avoid this, right? And this is some good guidance, regardless of which way you go through. And it goes into really, you do need to understand, you need to start getting a little bit more informed about that world, right? Like whatever the industry is, that field is. And the main thing is you're looking for standards, right? You're looking for the best standards out there. You want to make sure that whether you're building something yourself or you're leveraging a vendor, that they're using some sort of open standard, some agreed upon standards in the field, not something that is so specific, right? Something that's very, that you can only do with them. You want to make sure you have those because that's going to give you that flexibility to kind of jump around. And again, even if you build something yourself, I think earlier on you said, that you just put a little bit of a band-aid on the cut for now, but then you need to extend. If you stick to those standards, you could achieve what you need to do, but then you set yourself up to transition to something more robust, something more down the line. And that's probably one of the biggest things. And just doing your research, whether you're building it yourself, doing your research on standards, or doing your research on the vendors to say which ones are involved in the community, which ones are following standards, which ones tout those types of things. That's one of the biggest ways to kind of avoid vendor lock-in.
Yeah, and I think that makes complete sense. I think, in engineering practices, there's quite a few different standards that are coming out now, such as open telemetry. A few years ago, there was vendor lock-in in terms of, having to use big companies. I'll name a couple like Splunk, Datadog. But what we found is that now that these standards are coming up, it actually starts commoditizing the services a lot more. So there's more vendors coming up. And as something becomes more commoditized, the cheaper it becomes. And I think what's interesting is that even if you decide not to buy now, in terms of that they didn't have all the capabilities and maybe it was too expensive for the ROI, is that as the standard comes out and it becomes more commoditized and becomes cheaper, at some point you might want to switch because you realize it's actually not IP for yourself. And now it actually makes sense to reinvest that money.
Yeah, actually, let's dive into that just a little bit more because it kind of speaks to the whole concept of cost and then locking yourself in, right? Is perfect example. Love the monitoring capabilities with open telemetry. Historically, you would install the vendors agents on your boxes, right?
Yeah.
And that then it's enabling you doing these things, right? But now if you decide one day that you want to switch, well, it's not just about switching. It's not just about like, oh, switching the vendor, that's cool, plug and play. Well, now I need to redeploy all my infrastructure with those new agents.
Yeah.
I might need to change the things that I've done within my code, my application code itself, that gives me a little bit deeper insights versus things like OpenTelemetry where I put I install the collector and everything once, I implement it in my code base one way, and now you're absolutely right that the where the things get stored and all the analysis now becomes more about that and less about the collecting aspect, and it just makes you a lot more nimble. So perfect example, and then as we talk about the cost is think about the implementation itself, right? Because if it's a super specific implementation for that vendor, now
Yeah.
you're potentially putting the risk of future cost of having to reinstall or re-implement a whole new way of doing things, and that makes it kind of hard. So whenever going back to like nothing is free, when you talk about how you're going to integrate, you want to make sure that is as flexible as possible. because that integration point is something you
Yep.
don't want to have to change. It protects the rest of your suite from having to make all these changes over time.
Absolutely. And I think there's maybe one subject that we didn't actually talk about at all, because there's buy versus build, but there's one in between, which is open source. Now, how would you classify open source? Is it a buy? Is it a build? Because if you do open source, you typically have to, host it yourself, build the infrastructure to host it. How would you categorize it?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, and it kind of adds this whole other spectrum, because it does make it capable of building yourself, right? Which is good. And open source tends to be very deep on open standards, right? And standards that they're going there, so that's always a good one. What's interesting about open source is it does allow you to start building stuff yourself. Kind of refer back to earlier in this chat when we're talking about the cost of that, building some yourself. Yes, it gives you a head start to things, but there's still the uptick of having to learn how to use it, needing to understand the field, right? Because that's another thing is we spoke about the complexities that a field could bring into place and getting ahead of that. Um, a lot of these open source options tend to come with a future option to pay for like support or pay for some enterprise type thing. So it's for some companies that could be a good route where they maybe start with something's open source and then that opens up the door to do those other things. And then
Yeah.
it also depends on what we're talking about. Like you and I mentioned open telemetry. In the eventing space, there's also some open source concepts for there as well. And it really depends on what it is because we're talking about open source from a implementation perspective, which is always a good idea. Like whether you're buying or building, it always is good use to use those open source open telemetry standards
Yeah.
as the communication layer. Um, but then for the ones that it's just open source entirely, soup to nuts, it's your whole solution. That's where the enterprise options kind of come into place.
Yeah.
But it is a good transition period. It could help you kind of like start off with something.
Absolutely. And I think, from an enterprise perspective, I think open source is nice, but there's always obviously concerns around security and vulnerability scanning. I mean, that has to happen. And if there is critical bugs and they are like compromising bugs in terms of security, like who's responsible to fix them? And I think that's
Yeah,
definitely where, rather buying something off the shelf so you can hold the host that created the open source project in the first place, which is typically them, their cloud version. They're the ones that assume the responsibility to make sure there's patching and make sure there's tight security controls. Awesome.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
we've
and
only
that's also because I'm sorry, but that's also because the investment in open source. A lot of companies look at open source and they're like, "Oh, cool, it's free." Like I did those things. But what they're not realizing is that the ones who get most advantage from open source are those who contribute to the community, to the open source itself, right? So
yeah,
these companies that do take open source and provide a support structure on top of it, it is in their best interest to be part of that community, to feed back into it. There's a lot of companies that just again they open source, it's free, it's there, but if they have a need and they're not contributing back to that community, the community is going to
yeah,
do whatever is the best for the community, not and there's no driving force for your needs to put into it. So that's another good
absolutely.
aspect of even open source. If you're not willing to make the investment in contributing back to the community, giving in, being an active part of it,
Yeah,
that is another thing to consider.
absolutely. And I mean, there has been cases in the last year as well where open source licensing has changed, where you actually have to start paying a license, and that
Yeah,
flips companies
or
almost
stopped
upside down.
altogether.
Yeah,
Yeah, like so for example, you have the Cloud Native Foundation that has a whole bunch of open source products. Some of those things don't make it. They're super hyped.
yeah,
They end up on the grand stage. People are talking about them left and right, and then next thing you know, they kind of just sort of fizzle, right? So
yeah.
open source is a great option, but again, depending on how much community access you have, depending how much things is going to go into it, you do run that risk of it just kind of like losing steam.
Absolutely. So I'm just conscious for time. We've got a
Of
bit of
course.
time now for some questions and answers. Uh, I mean, before we do them, is there maybe a key takeaway that you would like to say in terms of someone that's saying, okay, do I buy or build this? Like, what would be the final comment that you would like for them to take away?
Yeah, again, the biggest one, focus on the why, right? And the business why, not the well, I want to install this because I need it, right? That's not a why, right? It's how does it translate to the feature or the enabler that's going to help your software, your business ultimately. Focus on that and don't lose sight of all of the hidden cost that comes into it, right? Obviously, we're talking about dollars and the initial cost, but there's also the ongoing cost. There's the ongoing cost of the experience, right? The expertise in that field. So um, and and then of course think about now regardless of what you decide, just always think of the future and make sure you set yourself up for success regardless of which way you go. make sure that you're flexible. Think about the standards, do your research, do all those things. So those are the big three takeaways I would say. Again, focus on your why. Think about all the levels of cost, not just the dollar one, and then think about your future, right? Make sure you set yourself up to be flexible going forward.
Amazing. Awesome. So let's go through some of the questions. So we have Ricky that is asking, how should teams calculate the true cost of building versus buying? Example, engineering time, maintenance, opportunity cost, technical debt. How would you say teams should calculate that?
Yeah, I mean, again, when it comes to engineering, and this is sort of the crux of everything overall time, is it's all estimation, right? So you're kind of, well, actually, that's a good point. When you're building something yourself, it is all estimation. You're kind of going off what we think it could build it. When you're buying something off the shelf, it's pretty cut and dry. I mean, sometimes there's like these weird usage hidden costs, but the costs are out there, right? This is, these vendors have thought through about the pricing model and kind of brought it in. When you're building, it's a huge, you're at the risk of estimation. So that is something to keep in mind. And then again, things like tech debt, we spoke about that earlier, right? It's not just the tech debt, right? Maintaining that server, keeping it up to date, making sure that this thing is following through, but also the debt of expertise in the field as well. So that's another way. As far as calculating that, it all ends up coming down to resources and the
Yeah.
estimations for that. So like, how long are you going to need these specific roles to achieve that? As you can see, that starts getting kind of complex when you don't understand the field. Like, how do I hire a security compliance person? Just like, how would I hire someone who's in the know
Yeah.
of insurance or human resource rules and laws out there? So that's just,
Yeah.
it always comes down to that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think, technical debt itself is an interesting one because it's a delayed debt. It's not something you feel straight
Yeah.
away. It's something that you only feel in about a year's time, or six months to a year when you start seeing some of the rot come through based of, something scaling isn't happening. But yeah, I would say that's delayed, and that's typically part of the maintenance cost that you would have to pay. And in terms of
Yeah.
opportunity cost, it's also the lost opportunity cost by focusing on something.
Yep.
What is the lost opportunity? And that's also very unknown because I would say generally organizations try and capture that on an OpEx or a CapEx model. That's usually just high level, sort of lost
Yep.
detail, but it's enough to give a business a sense as to how much this thing has cost. But I would say generally it's very difficult to cost the true or truly understand the true ROI.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Cool. The next question is from Tiago. So, how does a company's size, industry, or growth stage influence the buy versus build decision? That's a very good question.
Yeah, it's huge, and that's a great question, and it kind of goes a little bit to like where you are in your maturity, even on whether you have a platform team or not, right? That's the company size could dictate that whether you're willing to make that investment in a team that's constantly focused on this centralized problems, solving those things and these enablers. But company size would be huge, right? Um, we spoke about not just the monetary cost, but the expertise cost, the roles and the mindset you're going to have to stay ahead of things, right? The whole reason you're doing this is because you want to position yourself to be successful in your market, right? So if you're doing that, you're going to be hindered by not having the expertise in house. So I would tend to say the industry shows, and it's also opinion, is that the smaller the company is, you tend to want to go with a buy perspective because you don't have
Yeah,
the initial upfront, influx of cash and everything to really stay ahead of what that industry is doing. And also, you don't want to distract your focus from your field, from your business. Let's say your business is insurance, human capital, or school education, something, how much are you really willing to like stop focusing on these problems in your market specifically you're trying to do and focus over here? So in a lot of cases, you're just not big enough to know what's going on over
yeah,
here. And you want to rely on people who that is their business. So I would say company size is huge on your build versus buy. What, 10 the 10 things we tend to see is the smaller the company, the more inclined they are to buy something because it helps them really jumpstart. Again, you don't get caught in that cycle of like, oh, I spent too much time on this, kill it before it even becomes a thing. Larger companies tend to have a little bit more appetite to build things, but even then, they do fall. Larger companies, keep in mind, they're putting even more of a focus on like numbers and ROI and are we investing in the right thing? You've got a board, you've got stockholders to think about, so they're
yeah,
going to want to make sure you tie into that why a little bit closer. So there's a whole bunch of reasons that would bring you towards buy typically in this space. But again,
yeah,
sometimes there are reasons to build. David, you mentioned earlier
yeah,
about wanting that control, right? If you're a security company, you might need that control. It really depends on that.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, from a startup perspective, because we've done a few startups now, is that sometimes the ability that you want to buy is just maybe out of reach. Maybe sometimes these licenses are too much. But the reality as a startup is that you probably could build something very simple. And at the point that you do start making money, that's at that point you swap it out. So you don't put too much emphasis in that thing that you do build initially, because the only time that, in the beginning of a startup, the only thing you have is your time, and you have to utilize that as much as you can. And so the idea is like, yeah, you can't always afford some of these tools, but the idea is if you do have to build it, do it really cheaply. It's not like you're going to be the next Facebook overnight, so to
Yeah.
speak. You're not going to
Oh,
have
and
to get that
also to that,
Netflix scalability.
yeah, 100%. And also to that point, though, you bring up a point you kind of sparked in my mind is that the costs are a little bit clearer with buying, right? So if you're a new company and you're not sure how to estimate things correctly, you're trying to going into new territory, there's a lot of variability that goes on there
Yeah,
versus even if that cost does seem a little steep with a vendor, or even if it's there, it's fixed, right? Or at least it's clear on being able to see what that is. So that's another thing to consider too, is how clear is that cost to you versus how much kind of fuzziness and flexibility is it going to be? How much variability is in that cost when you kind of just don't know? So just another thing to consider.
absolutely. So I'm just recognizing we're close to our time. Do you have time for maybe one more question?
I do, yeah, sure, you can
Brilliant.
get one in there.
So I think the next one is if a company's intellectual property relies on external providers, some may see this as a potential risk. Do you consider this as a significant concern? And why or why not would you not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's one of the reasons why we kind of decided when we were going to have this conversation to keep the scope more about general services, because then we start getting into when there's a feature of yours that actively depends on those. To me, that starts looking into more of like the integration games, like a partner ecosystem of integrations, because it's within the same vein of your market of your field,
Yeah,
and it's sort of adding to that. I think intellectual property and actually, and if it's something that's tied to your field, there's absolutely more risk there, right? Because it's no longer this cog in a wheel that you might be able to replace using open standards and things like that. Usually, it's a little bit more niche. And at that point, it's always important to definitely do your research on that vendor and that partner, and make sure it at that point it becomes even more important to start building relationships, right? That right, a lot of we're here talking about software as it's this the buying off the shelf. It's so impersonal,
yeah,
but in a lot of these cases, having building this relationship with these vendors, you also want to make sure, just like you're hiring someone, you want to make sure these are folks that you work with. And I think you build that relationship that helps protect some of the risks behind that intellectual property, as it's relying on the external providers.
absolutely. And I think that is a really good segue in the future to talk about some of the other services. So we've been talking about generic services now. The other ones that I mentioned in the beginning is that there's a lot of time that's spent in terms of just integrations, like how do you integrate systems, third parties, and whatnot. And there's data and security topics that also there's a lot of consideration versus buy versus build. And the questioning is very separate. They're all very niche in terms of the things that you probably would want to focus on. I think that's actually probably a great segue for future chats.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a whole. I think it's why we wanted to keep it so specific, because there's a whole slew of things to talk about when we talk about it. And then what's interesting is that there is a crossover, because a lot of these generic services are stepping stones to the more intellectual IP. Again, all these integration ways, the ways that you communicate with those systems, the way data is stored. The IP isn't the solution itself; it becomes the configurations within there. It becomes the IP, right? That becomes the secret sauce. So,
Absolutely.
but that's teasing out for more future, I suppose.
Amazing. Well, look, I think we've reached the end for today. I just want to say thank you so much for your time and for your expertise in the field. I really look forward to being able to have more future conversations with you, especially maybe diving deeper into some of these topics. And yeah, I mean, if you want to say any final last words, that'll be great.
No, again, I want to thank David and the team for inviting me to this stuff. It's always a fun to kind of just nerd out about these types of topics. So it's great. Thank you to the audience for participating, asking the questions, and hope anybody who's going to watch this sort of after the fact. I hope it strikes up some thoughts, right? And it makes you think about how you look at the buy versus build itself, or maybe it thinks about the concept of a platform team. Is your company ready for that? Is your company ready to engage in some of these vendors? Hope this helps, right? And hope this kind of keeps in mind. And again, thank you all so much for your time.
Brilliant. Perfect. Well, let's leave it at that, and then yeah, we'll chat soon.
Perfect. Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thank you for the
Thank
rest of
you.
the team and everyone.
Cheers. Bye.